Good afternoon. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for joining us today. Let me begin by acknowledging the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, including lead sponsor Bank of America, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, Raytheon, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, WBUR, and NECN. There are a number of reasons why it is fitting for us to host this presentation. As a presidential library, we are honored to commemorate and pay tribute to the life of our 26th president. Yet, as we know by reading Edmund Morris, Theodore Roosevelt was so much more than just our nation's highest office holder. Roosevelt's life as an author, safari hunter, Cuban Rough Rider also parallels in curious ways another man we honor in this institution, Ernest Hemingway, whose papers are among this library's treasures. A few years ago at a forum on a movable feast, the New Yorker writer Adam Gopnik commented on what he perceived as, quote, an odd symmetry between John F. Kennedy and Hemingway, in the sense that they were both men of very complicated accomplishment, both men about whom it's possible to have ambivalent feelings, who, nonetheless, Mr. Gopnik concluded, continued to radiate, perhaps because of some essential gallantry in their lives, an aura of heroism that seems undiminished 50 years on. The same could be said for Theodore Roosevelt, though over 100 years have passed since the time period that we will hear discussed today. Another type of pairing that is apropos to today's gathering is that of biographer and subject, a type of marriage, if you will, between the likes of David McCullough and John Adams, Arthur Schlesinger and Andrew Jackson, Doris Kearns Goodwin and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Robert Caro and Lyndon Johnson, all of whom, I note, won the Pulitzer Prize, as did Edmund Morris, and his larger-than-life subject and tacit partner in this endeavor, Theodore Roosevelt, who once remarked, not so tacitly, "I have enjoyed life as much as any 9 men I know." To chronicle the 9 lives of Teddy Roosevelt has been the task of Edmund Morris these past 30 years, culminating in 3 mesmerizing books containing over 1 million words and 2,500 pages. The first, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, not only earned him a Pulitzer, but also the National Book Award. The second, Theodore Rex, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for biography. And the final volume, Colonel Roosevelt, tells the story of TR's extraordinary post-presidency. Jimmy Carter is not the only president to excel in that art. Woodrow Wilson, whose life was also greatly affected by TR's post-presidency, once noted, "You can't resist the man. He's a great big boy. There is a sweetness about him that is very compelling." This is the character that we meet and are charmed by in Mr. Morris's book, and whose despair, especially at the end of his life, we feel is our own. Our moderator this afternoon is Mark Feeney, also a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, for his featured writing in the Boston Globe, where he has worked since 1979 in a variety of roles from arts writer to book review editor. Mr. Feeney is an author himself of Nixon at the Movies, a book about belief. There is, as I have alluded, great sadness at the end of this volume. Mr. Morris speculates that in more ways than one, it could be said that Teddy Roosevelt died of a broken heart. And for those of us who have been transfixed by these 3 volumes, we too experience a sense of loss as we reach the end of the road in this masterful literary journey. Please join me in welcoming back to the Kennedy Library, Mark Feeney and Edmund Morris.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Edmund and I will be talking for about an hour, and then for about half an hour, there'll be time for questions from those of you in the audience. You'll notice that there's a microphone there. This event is being recorded, a microphone there as well. So if you do have a question in about an hour, just please come to the microphone and you'll be recognized and you can ask your question. But in the meantime, I'm your surrogate. As I'm sure everyone here knows, the youngest man ever to serve as president was Theodore Roosevelt, and the youngest man ever elected as president was John F. Kennedy, and we are here at the Kennedy Library. Might you talk about TR and JFK, a relationship between them, one's view of the other? We don't know what TR thought of JFK. An affinity between them. Tom mentioned an affinity between Hemingway and TR. What about TR and JFK?
Well, while I try to think of an answer to that, I'll just welcome you all here and all you football haters of Washington, of Boston. And it's nice, too, to see so many Republicans who couldn't manage to get tickets on the plane to Los Angeles for the centennial celebration today. Let that be a lesson for you to get your tickets early if you want to go to the unveiling on Mount Rushmore. JFK and TR, well, apart from youth, they had this indefinable quality of personal luster. In JFK's case, I don't really have to go on about it so much, but he discharged a luster which famously made Nixon in debate look pallid and awkward. Kennedy had an effulgence about him which I, as a nightclub photographer in Durban, South Africa in 1963, could feel. When I came home from a gig one night in the beach clubs of Durban, and I turned on South African radio, it was playing this dirge-like classical music. Couldn't understand why they're playing Beethoven at 1 o'clock in the morning. And after half an hour of this solemn music, a voice said, "We are mourning the death today of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, whose life was tragically short." And at that remote part of the world, I felt completely devastated. I felt something vital had been expunged. So Kennedy's luster, which is the only word I can think of, was felt around the world. And TR's electricity, to use a word which is more frequently used about him, over and over again in descriptions of TR, you hear this word electricity, radioactivity. Sometimes he was compared to a steam engine. It was this discharge of force. So they both had that, and this quality of motivating people, of warming them with your luster, of energizing them with your steam power and your electricity, is something which is bred in the bone and is born, and which can translate into real political power. They were both supernaturally smart, which is self-evident, and they both had humor, delicious humor. And just these three qualities I've listed, I'm sure there are more, are enough to make any man a pretty formidable candidate for political office.
Another way in which Kennedy and Roosevelt differed was that Kennedy never faced the challenge of a post-presidency. And that, of course, TR's post-presidency is what Colonel Roosevelt is about. That idea of, they probably never even used that term back then. But of course, we're much aware of it now with places such as this, presidential libraries, and so forth. Might you care to talk a little bit about the idea of a post-presidency and seeing it through the lens of TR's unique and quite turbulent experience as a post-president who wanted to be president again?
Well, the youth was still there, of course. He was only 50 when he left the White House. And still full of vigor and still palpably enjoying power. He gave up power in 1908 when it was a third term was handed to him on a silver platter by the Republican Party, but he turned down that opportunity because, I think for genuinely noble reasons. He felt that if he had another term, enjoying power as much as he did and executing the office as vigorously as he did, I think in his moral heart he sensed that he might become overweeningly authoritarian, self-righteous, and veer toward corruption. So he pushed away the silver platter. He went off to Africa for a year to give President Taft, his hand-picked successor, a chance to build a presidential profile for himself. And it was really only when he came back from Africa, after a year away in the spring of 1910, that he realized what an enormous demand there was in the United States, particularly among Republican progressives, for him to come back and assume leadership of their movement. So with all this youth, all this desire for power, which had returned already, he really did want to be president again. He found it more or less impossible to resist the invitations of the progressives to run in 1912. And the story of his defeat is a story we can go into if we want, but he made of his post-presidency a series of adventures that from my point of view, made the third volume more interesting to write than the other two. Because not only did he run again for the presidency, he became an explorer, went to South America, and explored a river longer than the Rhine, completely unknown river. He wrote many books. He became president of the American Historical Association. Then he became the great evangelist for American participation in World War I, and lived a magnificent final decade.
Well, you call it magnificent, but it was full of disappointments at the same time, wasn't it?
Well, it was magnificent tragedy, if you like. Tragedy has to be magnificent, otherwise it's just pathos. He was brought down by his greatest faults, and his death was tragically magnificent. From the narrative point of view, you could say that over the whole arc of his life, it had the shape of a Greek tragedy, of a man who made himself great, who reached enormous power, the great climax of the presidency. Then, having left the presidency, committed the act of hubris by running again in 1912. At the climax of that campaign, he gets smacked in the chest by a bullet. The story I could very briefly give you to show you what high drama it was. A story, by the way, which is uncannily similar to the story of the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in March of 1981. Here was TR coming out of his hotel room on October the 14th, 1912, stepping into the limousine that was waiting for him to take him to his speaking engagement that night, 8 o'clock in the evening, and a crowd collected around the limousine to welcome him. As he climbed into the car, just like Reagan, as he approached his limo, the crowd cheered, he waved, as Reagan had, and in both cases, a short, blonde, dull-eyed man stepped forward and shot TR point blank in the chest. The bullet went through his overcoat, his jacket, his waistcoat, into his waistcoat pocket, smacked into his steel-rimmed spectacle case, and then went through his 50-page speech, which was double-folded, so it's 100 pages of thick paper, then on through his shirt and hit a rib, on a trajectory which, if it had continued, would have gone right into his heart, and he would have been dead before he sat down. And TR, being TR, the consummate showman, insisted on being taken to the Milwaukee Auditorium to deliver his speech, even though he felt blood spreading across his shirt. And when he got there, one of his guys went out on the stage and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Roosevelt has been shot, but he does want to address you tonight," which got their attention. And out TR came and said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." There's a photograph in my book of the perforated speech, which is now in the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace. Of course, he survived and went on to these other great things, but I just cite that particular example as the moment when everything began to go wrong. Mm-hmm. The act of hubris had occurred, the decision to run again, the catastrophe happened, and from that moment, even though he went on to great things, his life was a pretty steady, inexorable decline to his death at age 60 in 1919.
And if I read you right, you would argue that had he not run in 1912 and waited till 1916, he would have easily beaten Wilson. Is that correct?
I don't maintain Wilson.
If Roosevelt had not run in 1912,
mm-hmm.
and then run in 1916 instead, rather than Charles Evans Hughes, he would have beaten Wilson.
Yes, I think that's a pretty safe speculation because, as you know, Charles Evans Hughes was the nominee that year, and Wilson defeated him by such a narrow margin that at first it was a Truman versus, who was the guy?
Dewey.
Dewey versus Dewey situation. Charles Evans Hughes' victory was in fact announced by the New York Times, till they suddenly decided that California had contributed enough votes and Wilson in fact had been re-elected. So it stands to reason that if TR had been campaigning that year on the GOP ticket instead of the lackluster Charles Evans Hughes, he would have won.
Yeah.
It's also beyond question that if he had survived through 1919 and been renominated in 1920, which unquestionably he was going to be. He was going to be the Republican nominee in 1920. He would have won in 1920 because there was such a Republican landslide that year that even Warren Harding was elected.
You mentioned earlier comparing the assassination attempt on Reagan with the assassination attempt on Roosevelt. As Reagan's official biographer, you had extraordinary access to him and to the White House. This was after you had published your first volume, but before you wrote your second and third Roosevelt volumes. How did that access change and inform your view of the presidency? Do you think it added something to your writing about Roosevelt, as it obviously did to your writing about Reagan?
Yes, it added a lot, because I began Theodore Rex almost immediately after finishing my first book. I began it, in fact, the year Reagan was elected president. And I was having a lot of difficulty understanding the way the White House worked, simply because I am not by nature a political scientist, and I really didn't know too much about hard operational Washington politics. So I was making heavy weather of that book. And then Reagan was elected, and I had this opportunity to become his biographer, which at first I resisted because TR seemed to me in 1981, 82, even in 1983, TR seemed to me so much more fascinating and important than Reagan that it was just no contest between the two. But by 1983, Reagan's presidency was achieving gravitas. It had received critical mass. That year was the great confrontation of the Soviet Union over the evil empire and the SDI, and the Korean airliner was shot down, and we were emplacing missiles in Europe, and it was the climax of the economic crisis, which Reagan transcended. So I began to realize that this president is a substantial president, and his presidency is also extremely dramatic. And maybe I was an idiot not to take the opportunity to write about him. So I did. I became his biographer. And in the process began to learn, by being there in the White House, how the White House worked. The elements of the presidency do not change year by year and century by century. The elements are always the same. Even so, sitting in the White House at meetings which sometimes became very boring, I found myself still hankering to go back to TR. Enough of Theodore Rex was written that I was still in my head thinking of paragraphs. And in one meeting I doodled a few paragraphs on a yellow legal pad, which I forgot about at the end of the meeting. It was in the Roosevelt room, ironically. And at the end of the meeting, I was walking down the corridor to the Oval Office. I think I had an interview scheduled with the president. And one of the White House secretaries came running after me saying, Mr. Morris, you forgot your notes. I said, oh, thank you. She said, sir, you ought to be more careful about national security. I said, why? She said, well, it says here the president's plotting a revolution in Panama. So I realized then that no biographer can serve two masters. And I put TR aside, but when I went back to Theodore Rex after publishing Dutch, I understood much better how the White House worked.
What's the single biggest misconception about Theodore Roosevelt? He has such a strong image in the public mind, but what does the public not get about him?
Oh, I think the single biggest misconception was that he was a cowboy, a rough rider, a bragging bully, an unsubtle person. TR was as unsubtle as a Siamese cat. He was a man of extreme intellectual sophistication. He was erudite. He read, as is famously known, on average a book a day. He read in French and German and Italian, as well as in English. He was a bona fide intellectual whose 40 books cover military history, biography, memoir, wildlife writing, political analysis, all sorts of subjects. He had a range of acquaintance around the world, unmatched by any other American president I can think of. He had Japanese friends, French aristocrats, Brazilian army officers, English toffs, royalty. He knew everybody. He corresponded with everybody. So, and this gave him an extremely deep and rich appreciation of foreign cultures. To give you just one example of how this mental fertilization affected his behavior, when he got to Cairo in the spring of 1910, having spent that year in Africa as ex-president, he wanted to go to the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, which is the oldest university in the world. And when he arrived there, the mullahs were sitting around teaching madras to the students, sitting cross-legged on the floor. TR asked to be shown a scroll of the medieval travels of Ibn Battuta, the great Arabian Arab traveler. And you can imagine the delight of the mullahs to be asked a question of this guy. They rushed off to their library to get this medieval scroll, while TR explained to the other mullahs that, of course, he'd not read it in Arabic. He said, but I did read it in French many years ago. I remember it very well, and began to recite chunks from it. So when he left that university with these dazzled mullahs salaaming as he left, he carried under his arm a copy of the Quran. Now, what other American president could carry off a feat of such intellectual grace and sensitivity as that?
The question answers itself. You mentioned his 40 books. Is it easier or harder writing about a fellow writer?
Well, I must say, for me, it made it easier because I'm by nature literary, which is to say I'm much more literary than I am political. Most books about presidents are written by politically interested individuals whose primary interest is politics. But with Theodore Roosevelt, throughout his life, I've identified with his literary side as much as, if not more so, than his political side. And for that reason, it's made it possible for me to deal with periods of his life which were densely political, such as 1912, which was nothing but politics from beginning to end. The knowledge that he was going to go on from that to more books and more letters and more essays made it easier for me to keep the narrative going.
If someone in the audience wanted to acquaint themselves with Roosevelt as a writer, is there one book or essay that you would recommend as a place to start?
Well, there's a little book published in the 1950s by Harvard University Press called Cowboys and Kings. And what it is simply an off-print of three of TR's greatest, longest letters. And these letters are so hilariously funny are so rich in personal reminiscence and detail, are so fascinating to read, and discharge such personality that anybody reading this slim book, it's only about 150 pages long, cannot but feel at full force this power of personality that I describe. The first letter is a huge letter describing his famous cross-country trip in the year 1903 as President of the United States, when he crossed to the Pacific coast for the first time. It's a series of anecdotes about all these little towns that he stopped at and how he was welcomed by the locals. And it is so delicious that you can understand how it came about that he wrote this letter, because when he got back to Washington in the spring of 1903, he went to have dinner with John Hay, his Secretary of State. And he began to tell all these stories about his famous trip across America. And John Hay, who, by the way, used to be Lincoln's private secretary, was then TR's Secretary of State, begged TR, please, Mr. President, will you write down these reminiscences of yours? They are priceless. Will you write them down for me? And TR eventually did produce this enormous letter, which he gave to John Hay. And that's the letter reproduced in this book, Cowboys and Kings. And the other two letters are equally enormous letters describing his grand tour of Europe in 1910, all the kings and emperors he stayed with, climaxing with the funeral of King Edward VII. It's a delicious little book, and I hope it's going to be reprinted at some point.
But it's obviously available in libraries, so
yeah,
you can track it down. You have a wonderful phrase in Colonel Roosevelt for his personality, explosive effervescence. I would imagine spending something in the vicinity of 35 years in the company of such explosive effervescence might get a little tiring. Did you ever find yourself tiring of him? Did he ever wear you out?
People did say that he was so explosively energetic that they just felt enervated by being close to him. I never felt that myself, but I did feel at the end of each of these big books that his personality was so overwhelming that I needed to get away from him. I didn't want to fall into the Arthur Link syndrome of becoming Mr. Woodrow Wilson. Arthur spent his entire life writing about Woodrow Wilson and producing these, I think, 60 volumes of Wilson's presidential papers, to the extent he began to look like Woodrow Wilson. So I got away from TR by writing about Reagan, which took me 15 years. When I went back to him, it was such a luxury of reacquaintance that it made writing Theodore Rex a delight. But then after finishing Theodore Rex, I needed another break, and I wrote about Beethoven. And that year, writing about Beethoven enabled me to go back to him a third time and complete this book.
Well, I have to ask that most annoying question to pose to someone who's completed a mighty task like this, and that is, what's next?
I really don't know. It's frankly, I haven't decided, but it's going to be something very different. I don't want to write about any more presidents. I wouldn't mind writing about another musician, but books on composers don't sell all that well. Beethoven did okay, but anyway, it'll be something non-presidential and non-Republican and non-political.
Reading Colonel Roosevelt, I found myself wondering about the children. They make them become so vivid in the book. And I wondered, did you ever meet Alice Roosevelt?
I did, actually. I didn't interview her so much as my wife, who wrote a book about Edith Kermit Roosevelt, TR's wife, and her long life, which went on to 1948. And Edith, of course, was much closer to Alice than... Well, Alice at least could talk about Edith in much more detail than any of the other children, being a woman. So I sort of sat in the corner while Sylvia was interviewing her. And she was then very old. And what I did get was a sense of her, how can I put it, her humorous malevolence. She found suffering and awkward situations very funny. While Sylvia was interviewing her, Archie Roosevelt, our good friend, Archibald Roosevelt Jr., was taking a shuttle down from New York to Washington while the interview was proceeding. And somehow Alice got a message during the course of the interview that Archie was having heart trouble on the plane. And Alice actually cackled. She loved people in distress. I also interviewed Archie Roosevelt and Ethel Derby, and found neither of them particularly interesting, because they both worshipped their father so much. It's always difficult interviewing children because the element of worship does tend to come in. The most rewarding interview, the most rewarding acquaintance, in fact, was with Archibald Roosevelt Jr., because he didn't realize how much like TR he was.
There's such an amazing cast of characters over the course of the 3 books. Do you have any favorites among them?
Favorite characters? I've always been very fond of Elihu Root. He's a forgotten name now, but he was one of the few strong men about by the way, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a great Secretary of State. He was one of the few men around TR who was not overawed by him. And he knew exactly how to treat TR with just the right amount of humorous, patronizing dispatch. For example, when TR turned 43 in the White House, Elihu wrote him a note saying, all your friends are delighted to hear that you've turned 43, and we have great hopes for you when you grow up. And on another occasion, somebody said to, TR apparently said to Root and to Henry Cabot Lodge, I was just at the White House talking to Woodrow Wilson, and he wouldn't send me to Europe to fight in the war because he knew I'd be killed in the war. And Elihu Root said, Theodore, if you had managed to convince him of that, I'm sure he would have sent you.
You mentioned Wilson. You're not much of a fan of Woodrow Wilson, I would hazard to say.
No, I admire Wilson simply because he was such a solitary manipulator of political Washington. One can't help admire him the same way one admires General de Gaulle, as an extremely cerebral, frosty megalomaniac. But I find him very narrow and crimped and Presbyterian and humorless. Although apparently everybody who knew Wilson in his domestic environment found him a delightful man, but to compare him in 1912 with TR, Wilson had no foreign experience, no sensitivity to foreign cultures. All he was interested in was congressional politics. He was a cerebral, rather dry academic with a beautiful prose style, I'll grant him that, but a man of no charm, no sweetness.
Let's turn the interview a bit to you from TR. Who are some of the biographers you think, or writers, who shaped your own writing style and did the most to influence you?
Charles Dickens, Mark Twain. One of the reasons I live in America was I fell in love with Tom Sawyer at the age of 10 and identified with him so much I wanted to come and live in America. And it was, of course, through Mark Twain's style that I got to love the American vernacular. And Dickens for humor and for narrative pace and for characterization. In my later years, Evelyn Waugh, who, in my opinion, is the greatest prose stylist of the 20th century. I delight in Evelyn Waugh's combination of extreme lucidity and extreme cruelty. His humor is splendidly cruel. And the American equivalent was S.J. Perelman, who was another superb stylist, whose whose virtuosity in language just gives one goosebumps. Le mot juste in every sentence. The exact placement of the right word at the right point. P.G. Wodehouse I should have mentioned too, because he, of all stylists, is the one who knows how to distribute words most powerfully. Jeeves uncovered the fragrant eggs and bee, and I pronged a moody forkful. Oh, the word forkful at the end of the sentence. Unbeatable.
You can all but taste the eggs.
Right.
What about biographers? Are there biographers you particularly admire? Whom would you like to write your biography?
I'll evade that question and say that Boswell to begin with and to end with. The first and the greatest of all biographies, Boswell's Life of Johnson. And to go from somebody famous to somebody extremely obscure, there was an American writer, biographer called Thomas Beer, B-E-E-R, who flourished in the 20s and 30s, wrote a lot of talk of the town type pieces for Saturday Evening Post. But he wrote 3 books in the 1920s. One was called The Mauve Decade, which made him famous, about the 1890s. The other was a biography of Mark Hanna, the Republican senator. And the other was a biography of Stephen Crane. Thomas Beer pioneered a biographical style that is very much like impressionistic painting, pointillistic coloration, extraordinary use of dialogue. He's a magnificent stylist. He made biography into an art, a literary art. He's completely forgotten now, but I admire him profoundly.
Do you think this is a good period for biography? Is it valued and practiced as well as it might be?
I think it is. I think the biography has taken the place of the novel, in the sense that biography, good biography, tends to be about extraordinary, compelling personalities passing through adventures and coming to some sort of resolution at the end, which is the recipe for all great novels in the past, but is no longer a recipe for good fiction.
You were born in Nairobi, and the book begins with T.R. on safari in Africa. Did you feel a personal resonance there? I mean, it's so vivid, the writing, even by your standards, in that section of the book. Did you feel that?
Well, all writers have capital that they like to spend, and I always was aware that I had this African capital that I needed to spend at some point, since I grew up in that country and accumulated a lot of atmospheric stuff. So to write about T.R.'s year in that part of the world where I lived was comparatively easy, because I knew all the landscapes that he trekked through. In fact, I've recently discovered that the house that he stayed in when he was in Nairobi in 1910, he would come in from the safari regularly, stay in this large grey stone house in Nairobi. It was right across the river from the house I grew up in. Now, when I was a small boy, going through my Tom Sawyer phase, I was aware of the fact that this famous American former president had come to Nairobi and had gone on a safari and taken care of about 3/4 of the wildlife of the East African colonies. But I didn't realize that he had been the guest of Lord and Lady Macmillan, whose house this was. I did know that Lady Macmillan, this old widow, was still living there when I was a kid, and I used to sometimes sneak across the river and worm my way through the bamboo palms and look at her on her terrace, having tea and being waited on by servants in white kanzus. And it occurs to me now that that's the veranda that T.R. sat on, writing his African game trails. And if I had known that when I was 10 years old, and had known that many years later I'd be writing his biography, I could have gone up to the old lady and said, "Please tell me about Theodore Roosevelt, Mrs. Macmillan." So there was that sort of childhood identity with him. I saw a picture of him when I was 10 years old, and I liked the look of him.
You can remember seeing that picture?
Yeah. in a civic history of Nairobi. There's a photograph of him in a pith helmet with his teeth showing. All those teeth. Yeah. And his mustache, and he just looked like fun.
Yeah. Did you travel much for your research? Did you try to follow his own paths and journeys?
Not really.
Yeah.
This time around I didn't, because I knew all of the Europe that I described, and I certainly knew the Africa. And to my regret, I never got to the River of Doubt, as Tweed Roosevelt did. He led an expedition there. And if I'd had the time and the money and the energy, I would have liked to have done that, but I didn't. What I did do, though, as far as the River of Doubt expedition was concerned, was go to all the Portuguese sources, the Brazilian sources, and with the aid of a Portuguese dictionary, managed to get a lot of information about that expedition that's not available in English.
Yeah. And after Colonel Roosevelt himself, I think the single most remarkable character in the book is Colonel Rondon. Is that how it's pronounced?
Colonel Cândido da Silva Rondon, yes.
Could you talk a little bit about him for those in the audience who haven't read the book yet?
Yeah, he's one of Brazil's great national heroes. Nominated, I believe, twice for the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize in 1920, for his work in behalf of the Brazilian Indian. He was practically almost 100% Indian himself. But when Theodore Roosevelt arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1910, what happened was he was there he thought to do an expedition for the American Museum of Natural History, an American expedition up the Tapajós River, the Papagaio River, I think it was. But a Brazilian foreign minister said to him, Colonel Roosevelt, would you consider a double expedition with one of our own colonels, Colonel Mariano da Silva Cândido Rondon? And if you would like to, he's our greatest explorer. He's explored the Brazilian outback. He's laid down telegraph lines. He knows the country as no other Brazilian does. If you would join with him to explore a river that he has discovered called the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt. It's called that because nobody knows where it goes. We think it's a tributary of the Amazon. If you will do this, and if you will write a book about it, we will finance the expedition. So that's how it occurred, that TR took this irresistible opportunity, as he said, to become a boy again, to go in search of this unknown river. So the two colonels led a binational expedition. The Brazilian half of the expedition was highly professional, all trained Brazilian army officers, photographers, seismographers, telegraph engineers, and TR's own complement, who are much more toward the natural history side. In the course of this long and extremely arduous and nearly fatal expedition, the two colonels bonded. They spoke French, that was their only common language. They had exactly co-equal status. They were both intellectually drawn. Colonel Rondon was a positivist and a lover of classical literature. To look at the books that they packed on their canoes going down the river is to be embarrassed as how unsophisticated we are these days. All these men were packing Homer, Thucydides, Camões, Jane Austen, and God knows what else. Colonel Rondon and TR achieved such synthesis that at the end of the expedition, they said farewell to each other on the ship that was bringing the seriously ill Theodore Roosevelt back home. TR said to Rondon in French, "I hope you will come and visit me in my country." And Rondon said, "I will when you next become President of the United States."
Another President of the United States, President Ronald Reagan, did he ever talk with you about Theodore Roosevelt? Did his name ever come up?
Did Reagan ever talk to me about TR?
Yeah.
Once, when I went in for my first interview, as I walked toward his desk, he said, "I'm not going to write up San Juan Hill for you."
Is there anybody on the political landscape today that you would see, however distantly, as a political descendant of Theodore Roosevelt?
Nope.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, guys like that come along once. Well, I wouldn't say once in a century or once in a generation, because they come along irregularly. But it seems to me that in American presidential history, the times always precipitate the man. Lincoln was precipitated by the Civil War. He was the only person who could have become president at that time. He embodied in his own divided nature the divisions of the Civil War. FDR was precipitated by the banking crisis, the Depression, and the class struggle of America in the 1930s. He was the only president who could have done what he did at the time. Nixon, that fatally flawed president, was precipitated by the crisis of the Vietnam years. America was self-doubting and tormented, and they produced a self-doubting and tormented president. The America of the 1980s wanted to be reborn, to recover its national spirit after the malaise of the Carter years, and it precipitated Ronald Reagan, and overnight the country became positive and began to recover its self-respect. Bill Clinton was precipitated by the cyberspatial 1990s, a period when the internet was beginning to take over all human discourse, when international borders dissolved away and people began to float freely in cyberspace. And we had this free-floating president who floated in whatever direction he could register the most hits. And he precisely expressed our national ethos at the time. And I could go on. So I think when the time requires it, another Theodore Roosevelt will be precipitated.
Well, that's a cheering thought. Well, TR was once described as, quote, the most interesting American who ever lived. Two-part question. Was he, and is he still?
Well, he's certainly the most interesting American I've ever studied. And it's pretty universally accepted, I think, in most of the reviews of books about him, not just my own book, that he was compulsively interesting. Mm-hmm. There are certain characters in history who are inexhaustibly interesting. Wagner, Lincoln, Charles de Gaulle, TR. Men of this quality can have books written about them forever, and all the books will be different because they are polychromatic and polygonal. There's just more and more and more to find out about them.
I'm wondering, would you mind reading a little bit from your book before we take questions from the audience? It just so happens we have a copy. And I should add, by the way, and I hope I'll remember to add at the end of the question and answer session, that Edmund will be signing books when we're done. But would you mind?
Okay, I'm sorry we couldn't talk about Edward Arlington Robinson.
Well, we'll do that and then all the questions. But the last three paragraphs, I think, are...
Oh, you've chosen it?
Well, you can choose something else. That would be my proposal, but we're here for you.
Just these two?
Yeah. It begins 3 decades later, and that refers to the present.
Okay, this is the end of the epilogue. The epilogue tells the story of TR's posthumous reputation, the rise and fall of his reputation, and all the major books that had been written about him since he died. So it brings us up to the present, and I say 3 decades later. The shifting sands of historiography seem to have allowed the monolith of Theodore Roosevelt to settle. Sand being sand, nothing of his future reputation can be predicted. He is still buffeted by revisionist storms, some emanating from academe, and obsessing on the latest idée fixe in that quarter, masculinity. But the prevailing breeze of popular opinion is favorable. A C-SPAN survey in 2009, rating the leadership of American presidents, placed T. Roosevelt at number 4, after Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. Substantial books on him continue to appear and are eagerly read. 3 recent examples by Kathleen Dorton, Candice Millard, and Patricia O'Toole demonstrate that for all the Rough Riders' machismo, fair-minded women feel no need to condescend to him. Douglas Brinkley's study of the Rooseveltian conservation record, The Wilderness Warrior, became a national bestseller last year, even though it was only over 900 pages long. The emplacement of Theodore Roosevelt Bridge across the Potomac River in Washington gives many commuters the impression that it, and not the forested island beneath, is the 26th President's official memorial. Somewhere among those trees, however, he stands 18 feet tall, one bronze fist upraised, eternally lecturing the doves and mockingbirds. Solemn words are carved on granite tablets nearby, but they, and all the millions of other words that have been published about him, come no closer to the truth than those of a small boy in Cove School, Oyster Bay, on June 16, 1922. As part of a class exercise, paying tribute to the late Colonel, Thomas Marr wrote, "He was a fulfiller of good intentions."
And one of the great intentions he fulfilled was the poetry of Edward Arlington Robinson.
I knew you'd get onto that.
And Edward Arlington Robinson provides the epigraph for each chapter in your book. Can you talk a little bit about T.R. and Edward Arlington Robinson?
Well, very briefly, Edwin Arlington Robinson, who won 3 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry, almost completely forgotten today, was a poet that Theodore Roosevelt fished out of hell by the hair of his head. And that's Arlington Robinson's language. Mm-hmm. He wrote to Kermit Roosevelt, "Your father fished me out of hell by the hair of my head." In the year 1905, when he was starving and working as a subway ticket stamper in New York City, T.R. read a short volume of self-published poems by Edward Arlington Robinson called The Children of the Night. And he admired the poems so much that he not only reviewed the book in Scribner's magazine, but he wrote Arlington Robinson a letter saying, "Dear Mr. Robinson," in so many words, "Dear Mr. Robinson, I have heard that you are in some financial difficulty. I have read your poems and admire them very much. Would you be interested in a federal position on strict condition that if you accept it, you will not do any federal work whatsoever, but will continue to write poetry?" And Robinson accepted this irresistible offer, became an officer in the Customs House in New York City, and proceeded to write poetry on the federal nickel for the rest of T.R.'s presidency. And after T.R. left the White House, Arlington Robinson went on from strength to strength, gradually winning recognition in the teens as the most original poetic voice in America outside of that of Robert Frost, his somewhat jealous rival. Went on to great fame and enormous success in the 20s and 30s until his dying day never ceased to praise Theodore Roosevelt for saving him. So in testimonial to that and also to the quality of his poetry, I've used as epigraphs to all my chapters sections from the poems of Edwin Arlington Robinson.
So not only do we have a president who read poetry while in office, he reviewed poetry while in office, and I guess you could say that he was the founder of the National Endowment for the Humanities through finding this job for Edwin Arlington Robinson.
A neat aperçu which never occurred to me.
Well, You're welcome to it for the paperback. If anyone in the audience would care to ask questions, there are microphones there and there. Please step up to them. And while we're waiting for people to come forward, I will ask, if I may, a Reagan question. This is the Centennial Day, and we wrote about it today. What are your feelings on Ronald Reagan at 100?
I admired him profoundly as president. It was impossible to fall in love with him, as many of his acolytes do. I found him so cool and so remote that I never disliked him or liked him. Mm-hmm. I felt completely objective about him. As a man, as a person, in private, I found him extraordinarily uninteresting. He had no interest in himself, and that was the reason. So to ask Reagan questions was to get nothing in return. He'd never thought about himself. He had no ego. He had a tremendous sense of id. He knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. Formidable id, but no vanity. That was perplexing to a biographer. His charm was delicious, but it was public charm. TR's charm could be felt privately, was most powerfully felt privately. Reagan's was discharged publicly. In private, none of this magic was apparent. He was, by nature, thespian. He was an actor. When he went out through the door, he became extraordinary. In private, there was nothing there. That is not to disparage him. I have to try and explain the mystery of the theatrical personality. They live, they are born, they exist to operate in the public sphere.
Well, and I apologize to those at the mic, I just want to ask this one last question. You could say, though, that TR was an actor, too, but he was much more of a stage actor. And had he been around 100 years later, the camera would have been horrified by him, because he was so vigorous, whereas Reagan had that genius of letting the camera come to him.
You're right. Once with Reagan, I watched his last speech to the American people. It was very telling. I went down to the Oval Office to watch him deliver it. He came in, and he seemed oddly ill at ease. There was like 5 minutes to go before 9 o'clock. Carrying a glass of hot lemon water in his hand, wrapped around with a white napkin, which he always drank before he spoke, and made his voice silky. And he sat down, but he seemed strangely ill at ease, and he kept looking at this dead monitor in the corner of the room. And the monitor flicked on at about a minute before the address with his picture on it. And Reagan said, there he is. And he became Ronald Reagan.
First question from over here.
Thank you, and thank you so much for this informative and lively book review. I hate to be the snake at the garden party, but I want to take him down a peg, and I'd like you to respond to this. When he took the trip down the River of Doubt, it was ill-planned. He certainly risked his son's life, who became a lifelong victim of malaria. He risked many other people's lives, simply without consideration, without thought about what he was doing. He risked his own life, which he did repeatedly. He seemed not to care about that so much. When World War I was in the offing, he urged, made fun of Woodrow Wilson for not going into the war. Woodrow Wilson finally went into the war. He urged his son to join this valorous soldier. Clinton was killed almost as soon as he entered the war. That was 1918. Roosevelt was heartbroken, died in 1919. Can we include this frivolous idea toward life and death, even among his own people, as part of his legacy? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, ma'am, because we have been rather too dwelling rather too much, I think, on TR's positive aspects. We actually did talk about Quentin a lot at a private meeting upstairs just now, But the points you raise are valid ones. There was something sick about his desire to fight in battle, in the sense that his desire to go and fight, and when he was denied the opportunity to lead a division of American volunteers at the age of 58 to Europe to fight aside the Free French, when he was denied that opportunity by Woodrow Wilson, quite rightly denied the opportunity, the sickness was his desire that his 4 sons should go and fight in his stead. And he made it quite plain that since he himself had been deprived of the privilege of being possibly killed in action, maybe one of his sons could do him that favor, which Quentin did. Quentin, I should say that all 4 sons went to war willingly. They were brought up to be hawks, as T.R. would say, not to be sparrows. Or was that Edith? That was Edith's line, wasn't it? Edith said, I would like my sons to be hawks, not sparrows. So it was in the mother's influence as well. But it was quite plain from what T.R. wrote that he rather hoped that one of his boys would be, or more, would be wounded and perhaps killed in battle, and so bring honor to the family name. When Quentin was killed in July of 1918, he was absolutely devastated, realizing how ugly war was, what death indeed was, realizing what had been stamped out in the death of this promising boy, who was the least bellicose of the 4, by the way. And he never quite recovered from that, and I'm quite sure that his grief for Quentin, which was extreme, contributed to his own early death just 5 months later.
Over here.
Mr. Morris, I wanted you to talk about the dialectic nature of Mr. Roosevelt, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a warmonger, great progressive, and as it turned out, a pretty rabid anti-Semite and racist. Would you please address these contrary natures of the president?
Well, you're quite wrong about a rabid anti-Semite. Absolutely wrong. T.R. had no Semitic anti-prejudice that I'm aware of. His racial policies I will discuss. But before I get into that important subject, let me just say that men of his dimensions embody in themselves contradictions. All of the men I cited earlier on, Wagner, Abraham Lincoln, and Napoleon and de Gaulle, contain profound contradictions within themselves. So everything, as I've often said about T.R., everything you say about him is true. Except I will argue about the anti-Semitic allegation. As you probably know, he appointed the first Jewish cabinet officer in our history, Oscar Strauss. He used to say when he went campaigning, took great pride in his mixed ancestry. He once said, campaigning in the Lower East Side, I wish I had a little Jew in me. His favorite policeman was Otto Raphael, this Jewish policeman that when T.R. was police commissioner of New York City, T.R. took a particular shine to this guy. And when T.R. as police commissioner had to guarantee security to an anti-Semitic German public orator who was coming to New York City to deliver a lot of anti-Semitic lectures, T.R. solved the problem of giving this guy security by giving him a bodyguard entirely of Jewish policemen.
I just think that goes to the contrary nature, because his rhetoric during the ramp-up and World War I towards Jewish bankers and the Jewish establishment has been well documented. So again, I think that just points out further, and I admire the president so, but it just always never fails to take me back when I look at the contrary nature of the president. And just one other thing. Was not the president's father someone who was involved during the Civil War in the warrant buying or buying himself out of the service, and I wonder if that had anything to do with later on his own need for glory and self-aggrandizement.
No, that theory is trotted out a lot, and there is absolutely no evidence for it whatsoever. He was proud of his father and admired him profoundly. I would like, though, to raise the question of race, which you brought out regarding American blacks. This is important, because TR here exhibited these contradictions. When he became president in 1901, the first person he called upon to advise him was Dr. Booker T. Washington, who was then the most eminent black leader in America. Brought him to the White House to advise him, and he famously gave him dinner in October of 1901 in the White House, the first time any president entertained a black man en famille, as it happened, creating a firestorm of racial outrage in the white South. And after this magnificent beginning and several very courageous appointments of black office holders during his first term, he severely blotted his copybook by his behavior during the Brownsville incident of 1906, when he, as commander-in-chief, discharged a whole regiment of black soldiers in Brownsville, Texas, for an alleged race riot on no evidence whatsoever. And although he realized he'd made a mistake, he would never go back on that decision, and he lost overnight the support of all the black Americans who so strongly identified with him. In 1912, he voluntarily and summarily decided not to allow blacks to participate in the Progressive Party in the Deep South. He gave his rationale for that. It's complex, and I don't want to go into it now because it'll take too long. It's in my book. But his record as an espouser and a friend of American blacks was very much damaged by his behavior at the time of Brownsville. And not surprisingly, Booker T. Washington came out for Wilson in 1912. Yes, sir.
After 2,500 pages, you decided to end your study with the words of a small boy. What brought you to that decision?
The words of a small boy, I'm sorry?
Thomas More.
Oh, yes, what about him?
What made you choose that?
Sorry, yes, early on, when I was writing my first book, I went through a bunch of old papers in the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace. And I came across a packet of essays written by these school children in 1922. Obviously, this class had been given an assignment by their teacher to write something about the dead colonel. And flicking through these childish essays, I came across this one essay by this one little boy with this one sentence that seemed so perfectly epigrammatic, summing up everything he was. He was the fulfiller of good intentions. When I saw it, I knew that was going to be the last sentence of the last book.
You made my day because Thomas More is my father.
Wow. So,
I came from Long Island to be here, just never expecting that you would say what you said.
extraordinary. Well, it's an honor to meet you, sir. Thank you for coming. If you give me your address afterwards, I'll send you a copy of this essay.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'll try to follow that one. I was just wondering, since the book is about his later life, whether or not you can comment on his relationship with and influence on his niece Eleanor, who I feel is a kaleidoscope of personality traits as well.
I don't know too much about his relationship with Eleanor. She was his brother's daughter, and he married her off as president to Franklin, the Two Roosevelts. For those of you who confuse the two branches of the Roosevelt family, the Hyde Park Roosevelts are mainly Democrats, and the Oyster Bay Roosevelts tend to be Republicans. And one of the Hyde Park Roosevelts once explained the difference even more succinctly. He said, "We're the good-looking ones." But I don't know too much about T.R.'s relationship with Eleanor, other than she was the wife of Franklin, whom he rather avuncularly liked and admired. But the relationship between Eleanor and the Oyster Bay Roosevelts deteriorated seriously in the 1920s.
Well, I know in some children's books I've read, she spent a lot of summers with him.
Yeah, she was one of the many cousins.
So I was wondering if he had any influence on her greatness and how she was interested in so many things. And
I really don't know.
All right, well, thank you.
Do you know, darling?
Well, I think the influence, FDR always said that TR was the greatest man he ever knew.
Yes, my wife was reminding me that FDR always used to say that cousin Ted was the greatest man I ever knew, but that doesn't tell us much about Eleanor.
No, but Eleanor was always considered the ugly duckling, remember? And Edith said one day the ugly duckling might turn out to be a swan.
My wife, who knows much more about Theodore Roosevelt than I do, reminds me that Edith Roosevelt once said that the ugly duckling is likely to turn out to be a swan one day. So, who's next? Yes, sir.
Mr. Morris, again, thank you for being here. Two quick comments and then a question. The first comment is that Sylvia Morris wrote a wonderful book, as you mentioned earlier, on Edith Roosevelt. And for those of you folks here, everyone, I suppose, interested in this topic, highly recommend reading that book. It presents a wonderful kind of softer side of the relationship of the president and Edith. And those of you that enjoy Mr. Morris's books, be sure. The only way to read them for me is to have two bookmarks, one in the narrative text and one in the endnotes. So if you're not inclined to read endnotes because it's not in your nature, I strongly recommend that you use two bookmarks and read them because they're as wonderful as the narrative text oftentimes. And I'm not from Random House or anything. I'm just offering that as a fan.
You're a footnote fetishist.
Yeah. Actually, Tweed accused me of that. I don't know if Tweed is still here. My question is about TR and his faith life. And as I've read, I don't know if to say often is the right term, but he would, at some level, use religious language, oftentimes in speeches and in other contexts. I think he, perhaps when he was in Oyster Bay, he would regularly go to church. And I'm just wondering, was his faith life, do you think, based on what you've studied of him, considered to be a genuinely devout faith, or was it more commensurate with men of that era? And was his language sometimes just based on political advantage?
Like all American politicians, he liked to thump the Bible. John Hay once said to him, "There's one thing I admire about you, Theodore, it's your original discovery of the Ten Commandments." And he was capable of conventional pieties. As for that matter, Ronald Reagan was. But I've never divined any spiritual aspirations in TR. He was uncomfortable with questions of spiritual dimension, of metaphysics. Very shy about talking about his own personal religious faith, if indeed he had one. He used to go to the Dutch Reformed Church, more or less de rigueur, and as president he would go to the Episcopal Church, St. John's in Washington, with his wife, who was devout. But he himself never struck me as particularly pious. In fact, he was the one who tried to get the phrase "In God We Trust" taken off our national coinage, on the interesting premise that it debased God to be have his name plastered all over filthy lucre. But I have begun to notice, researching the third book, in which I've gone much more deeply into his writings than in previous books, serious interest in his part in questions of theology versus science. For example, he wrote an astonishing essay in 1911, the single most impressive intellectual production of all his literary career, called The Search for Truth in a Spirit of Reverence. And it's about the conflict between evolutionary biology and orthodox religion, a topic which has become resurgent in recent years. And the breadth of theological and scientific knowledge that he displays in this piece, this long essay, based on readings in many languages, is truly amazing. And it comes closer than anything else he ever wrote to expressing his own personal attitude toward religion. But it was basically that of a standoff, cerebral theologian, rather than somebody full of natural piety. Well, I will if we get into that matter, yes. But I think we ought to cover questions that these people are answering. You can, if you like, go to the loudspeaker. Take your turn. She humiliated me once when I was lecturing early on about Tian. Some little old lady stood up and said, "Mr. Morris, what did he die of?" I didn't know. I hadn't gotten that far. So I stood there like an idiot, and Sylvia shouts out, "Pulmonary embolism." Yes, sir.
Actually, two quick questions. You said that his being shot and then the death of his son was sort of a steady decline, which he never really fully recovered from. I was interested for your opinion on, he once called his father the greatest man he ever knew. What affected his life more, his father or the tragedy with his first wife dying, Alice Lee, and his mother in 1884? Which do you think inspired him the most? Or was it a combination of those two things that went on to propel him? And secondly, great presidents like Lincoln transcended the radical Republicans. Theodore himself took on the establishment in the Republican Party. I guess where would Theodore fit in with the Republican Party today?
Well, the three great bereavements of his early life, the death of his father when he was a student at Harvard, and the double death of his wife, Alice Lee, his first wife, and his mother in the same house on the same night in 1884, did affect him to a certain extent, in the sense that they just made him tougher. He already was phenomenally tough. His attitude to the death of Alice Lee, which for a while seemed to unhinge him. For several days, TR went around like a complete zombie. And they worried that he might be losing his reason. But what he was doing was concentrating his faculties, erasing from his memory the very name of Alice Lee. He never spoke about her again, not even to their daughter, Alice Longworth. And these almost masochistic seeming suppressions formed the leather of which he was made later on in life. He was an indestructible person. Largely, I think, due to the cauterizing effect of these tragedies. The other question as to where he would stand in the Republican Party now. We must remember that back in 1910, 100 years ago, the Republican Party and Democratic Party were very different from what they are now. In fact, the Republican Party of Sarah Palin and the Tea Party members is more or less indistinguishable from the Democratic Party of 1910. Lily White, small government, reactionary, anti-privilege. Whereas the Republican Party of those days was the party of the black man, of racial liberals. and the party of big centralized government. TR was a big centralized government man of democratic instincts, and so much so to such a federal extent that I think if he was alive now, he would be a big government Democrat. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could just comment on the fact that he might have had a photographic memory.
Well, it is a fact, yes, it's a fact. His memory was photographic. Sometimes he would see a face that was vaguely familiar to him, and he would do this over his face, and then he would say, I remember you. You were standing by a train with steam all around you 12 years ago. There are countless anecdotes to show how photographic his memory was, how he could disgorge whole paragraphs of prose that he'd read 15 or 20 or 30 years before. And more than just anecdotes, I came across a concrete example when I was researching this book. A letter from Kermit, his son, writing to his father from Brazil in, 1913. Dad, do you by any chance remember a poem by Edith Thomas called Far from Castile? And T.R. wrote back in longhand, yes, you ask about Edith Thomas. Yes, it's called Far from Castile, and it goes like this. He wrote out 2 long stanzas and sent it off. So I thought, I'll check out this poem. I Googled Edith Thomas, and I found there was indeed a poet of that name who published in the 1890s. And I found this poem, Far from Castile, in an issue of the Atlantic Monthly, published, I think, in 1890 or 92, somewhere around there. And going through the magazine in order to read it, I checked its text against T.R.'s handwritten text of 17 years later. And it wasn't quite word for word. In about 3 instances, he wrote Lydian chord instead of Gordian knot. And sometimes a line was elided differently. But apart from these 2 or 3 minute differences, it was word to word what he had read in 1890. And I know he read it in 1890 because in that same issue of Atlantic Monthly was an article by himself.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say I was delighted with your assessment of Evil and Law, one of my favorite authors, Jane Austen and Graham Greene. I wonder, with your acerbic wit and your love of a language, have you ever written a novel?
No, I've never written a novel. I did write a biography of Ronald Reagan. That was not supposed to be funny. Which was a non-fiction biography told by an imaginary person. But that's the nearest I've ever gotten to it.
If I may ask one more quick question about politics. What is your take on the effectiveness of dynasties in American politics?
The effect of dynasties in American politics, I am not qualified to answer that. I really don't think I can say anything intelligent on that subject.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Yes, sir.
I have a quick comment and then a question. And my comment is that it was through your books that I really became a TR fan and a history student, so thank you for that. My question is, could you talk about his, I would say, controversial position in 1910 where a judicial decision could be overturned by a vote of the people? And did that have anything to do with the leadership in the Republican Party turning against him in 1912? Because that was the sense I got through reading your book. I was just wondering if you could talk about that and just tell me if I'm right or wrong.
Well, in 1910, when T.R. came back from Africa and from his grand tour of Europe, the most famous man in the world at that point, to this enormous welcome in New York City, where 1 million New Yorkers turned out to welcome him home, he was at the cusp of his life and wanted to spend the rest of his life writing books. But he was almost immediately prevailed upon here in Boston by Charles Evans Hughes at a Harvard commencement, who persuaded TR to support a progressive measure that Governor Hughes was trying to put through the New York State Legislature. TR made the fatal commitment under the elms of Harvard to aid Governor Hughes and thus got sucked back into active politics, finding himself during the course of the year becoming the spokesman for the uprising political movement, the political progressive movement, candidates who were trying to achieve election in the congressional elections of 1910, Republican progressives. And he campaigned for all of those who struck his fancy, but came on too strong, too fast, and too hard, putting all his gigantic prestige in behind a radical political message, articulated in his famous New Nationalism speech in Osawatomie, Kansas, at the end of August 1910. And that speech was so radical, espousing, for example, the superiority of labor over capital and the right of the people. He hoped to withdraw judicial decisions that were contrary to the popular interest, that it completely destroyed his goodwill in the Republican Party and laid the seeds of his dismissal from the party, or his denial on the part of Orthodox Republicans in 1912. So, as a matter of fact, the election of 1910 was a disaster for Theodore Roosevelt personally. Most of the candidates he espoused were defeated, and his political prestige evaporated so rapidly that by the end of the year, this man, who at the beginning of the year had been the most famous man in the world, had become a political nonentity. And it's one of the most remarkable things about his biography that somehow within the next 2 years he recovered all his gravitas and led that extraordinary campaign, which to this day is the most powerful third-party campaign in our history.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for helping history to come alive today and making it so vivid. I once heard James McGregor Burns give a talk after he had written a book about the three Roosevelts, Teddy, Franklin, and Eleanor. And if I remember correctly, he said that he felt the greatest of the three was Eleanor. And I'm just wondering what your opinion is. Who among the three would you feel was the greatest Roosevelt?
Well, FDR was the greater president. He dealt with greater issues, he served much longer, and he achieved greater things. Theodore Roosevelt was the greater personality. FDR, one goes to his house, one gets the feeling that there was nothing there except his political interests. Apart from that, and yachting, there was nothing there of any interest except to students of political animals. He was a superbly talented, an extraordinarily effective executive politician. All the other things that Theodore Roosevelt was, FDR never approached. TR was a man in the round, FDR was an executive. As for Eleanor, I absolutely must share with you an Eleanor Roosevelt joke, which I came across in the papers of James Gould Cousins, the great American novelist who I'm rather interested in. He worked in the Pentagon in World War II. I wrote a letter to his mother that I came across saying, Mom, I wonder if you'd like to hear the latest Eleanor joke. This is 1943. And he said, Eleanor walked into the Oval Office. She'd just come back from a transatlantic trip to Britain. And she said, Franklin, do you notice something different about me? And FDR, who was busy with affairs of state, said, new hairstyle. I said, Franklin, I've been wearing my hair like this since 1929. don't you notice something different about me? He said, well, yeah, new dress. You bought that in London. Franklin, I've been wearing this dress since our honeymoon. He said, Eleanor, I don't know, I'm busy. I can't see what's different about you. She said, Franklin, I'm wearing a gas mask.
A reminder that Edmund will be signing copies of his book. And let us thank him very much for joining us today.